What if every map you've ever seen was a lie? Not a mistake, not an error, but a carefully crafted deception, designed to bend reality to someone's will. Picture this: a medieval king unrolls a parchment, his finger tracing borders that bulge far beyond their true size, while rival lands shrink into insignificance. This wasn't just cartographic whimsy, it was power, etched in ink and vellum. For centuries, maps have been more than guides. They've been weapons of persuasion, tools to inflate egos, erase enemies, and rewrite the world to suit the agendas of those who ruled it. And the most fascinating part, these distortions weren't hidden. They were blatant, brazen, and utterly deliberate. Think about the last time you glanced at a map, maybe on your phone or in an atlas. We take for granted that what we're seeing is objective, a neutral reflection of the world as it is. But ancient mapmakers operated under no such illusion. To them, geography wasn't just about accuracy, it was about influence. A city might be drawn larger to emphasize its importance, or a rival kingdom might vanish entirely, scrubbed from the record like a bad memory. These weren't innocent choices, they were calculated moves in a high-stakes game of perception, where controlling the map meant controlling the narrative. And that narrative, it was always political. So why does this matter today? Because these ancient lies still echo in the way we see the world. The borders we recognize, the cities we prioritize, even the way we orient ourselves north at the top, as if it's some universal truth, all of it was shaped by centuries of manipulation. Behind every bend of a coastline or shift of a frontier, there's a story of ambition, fear, or sheer arrogance, and that's what we're about to uncover, the hidden fingerprints of power on the maps we thought we knew. From empires inflating their glory to cunning erasures of entire cultures, prepare to see these ancient documents in a whole new light, not as mirrors of the world, but as masterpieces of propaganda. The question isn't just how they distorted geography, but why they got away with it. Long before the compass or satellite imagery, the very first maps were less about guiding travelers and more about declaring dominance. Take the Babylonian Imago Mundi, carved into clay over 2,600 years ago. At its center sits Babylon itself, encircled by distant lands labeled vaguely as beyond the known. This wasn't just practicality, it was psychological warfare on parchment. By placing their kingdom at the heart of creation, Babylon's rulers told a story. Everything else was peripheral, secondary, almost mythical. Even the Greeks, celebrated for their scientific rigor, couldn't resist bending geography to their worldview. Ptolemy's 2nd century maps, revered as masterpieces of precision, quietly exaggerated the size of the Mediterranean, the heart of Greek and Roman power, while shrinking the Indian subcontinent to half its true scale. Why? Because to the empires that funded these maps, importance wasn't measured in miles but in political clout. A smaller India meant a smaller threat to their dominance, a sleight of hand that made their own territories loom larger in the imagination. But the most audacious trick, how these distortions were sold as truth. Mapmakers didn't whisper apologies for their biases, they wielded them proudly. When medieval European cartographers drew Jerusalem as the literal center of the world, they weren't hiding their agenda, they were evangelizing it. These maps hung in churches and palaces, their skewed geographies preached as divine order. To question the map was to question authority itself, a dangerous act in an age when heresy could cost you your life. What's startling is how little has changed in principle. Today's borders, our official world maps, even the way we zoom in on certain regions on digital globes, they're all descendants of that ancient propaganda. The tools have evolved, but the game remains the same. Shape the map, and you shape the minds of those who read it. So the next time you unfold a map, ask yourself not just what it shows, but who it's cheering for. Because behind every line lies a legacy of power, persuasion, and the occasional outright lie. Imperial ambition didn't just march on the battlefield, it crept across parchment, reshaping reality with every stroke of the pen. Take Rome's Tabula Peutingeriana, a sprawling medieval copy of an ancient Roman roadmap. At first glance, it's a practical guide to the empire's highways. But look closer. Italy bulges grotesquely at the center, while Britain and India squeeze into the margins like afterthoughts. The message was unmistakable. Rome wasn't just connected, it was the connective tissue of the world, its roads pulsing like veins under imperial control. By stretching these routes visually, mapmakers didn't just document infrastructure, they sold an illusion of seamless dominion, where every path led back to the heart of the empire. China's dynasties played the same game with even grander flair. The Kangxi Emperor's 18th century surveys depicted his realm as a unified, harmonious expanse, never mind the rebellions simmering in the provinces. Mountains bowed obediently toward the capital, rivers flowed with geometric precision. This wasn't geography, it was geopolitical theater. A fractured empire couldn't afford to look fragile, so its maps became mirrors reflecting not the truth, but the ambition. When envoys from rival states unrolled these scrolls, they didn't see borders, they saw inevitability. The genius of these distortions, they weaponized belief. A Roman citizen gazing at the Tabula Peutingeriana didn't just see roads, he felt the empire's grip tightening around the known world. A Chinese bureaucrat studying the Kangxi maps didn't just memorize borders, he internalized the myth of eternal unity. These weren't lies to be exposed, they were stories to be lived, and that's why they worked. When empires drew themselves larger than life, they didn't just claim land, they colonized imagination. What's chilling is how modern this ancient playbook feels. Today's superpowers still manipulate maps to flaunt influence, whether by exaggerating territorial claims or erasing contested regions altogether. The tools have changed, but the goal remains. Bend the map and the mind will follow. So the next time you see a map celebrating some golden age of unity or expansion, ask yourself, are you looking at the world as it was, or as someone desperately wanted it to be? Imagine a map where every inch of parchment pulses with divine purpose, where cities shrink or swell not by their real size, but by their holiness. That's the Hereford Map Mystique, a sprawling 13th century masterpiece that doesn't just depict the world, it preaches it. Jerusalem sits dead center, a golden bullseye in a cosmic dartboard, while Europe, Africa, and Asia bend inward like worshippers bowing toward salvation. But this wasn't navigation. This was indoctrination in ink. Venture toward the edges of the map, and the geography twists into a sermon. Distant lands crawl with monsters, dog-headed men, fire-breathing dragons, tribes with faces in their chests. These weren't just artistic flourishes, they were warnings. By painting the unfamiliar as grotesque or demonic, the Church framed exploration as perilous, heresy as geography. Why risk sailing off the map when the unknown was quite literally hellish? The genius, or perhaps the audacity, was how seamlessly spiritual authority bled into cartographic fact. Paradise wasn't tucked in some symbolic corner. It was drawn at the top, eastward, labeled plainly as the Garden of Eden. Time itself flowed from creation to judgment day along the map's axis, with Christ hovering above, presiding over the entire tableau. This wasn't a map you consulted, it was a map you obeyed, and obedience was the point. In an era when most couldn't read, these images were gospel. A peasant gazing at the map mundi didn't see continents, he saw cosmology. Jerusalem's centrality wasn't up for debate, it was baked into the earth itself. The church didn't just claim moral authority, it etched it into the land, making dissent seem as absurd as arguing with a mountain. Yet the most chilling detail, these maps were collaborative lies. Scholars, monks, and artists all contributed, weaving scripture into latitude and longitude until faith and geography were indistinguishable. When a bishop pointed to a map and declared, "This is God's world," he wasn't just interpreting, he was holding up a mirror to centuries of deliberate distortion. Today, we smirk at the thought of dragons lurking beyond the horizon. But ask yourself, what maps do we still accept uncritically? What borders or centers do we treat as natural, inevitable, divinely ordained? Because the Hereford Map mundi's greatest legacy isn't its monsters or its misplaced rivers. It's the reminder that every map, no matter how scientific it seems, carries the fingerprints of those who drew it. Sometimes those fingers are clasped in prayer. To claim a land, first you must unsee its people. That was the cartographer's dark art during the age of exploration, transforming bustling continents into blank slates with a few strokes of ink. Take John Speed's 17th century map of North America, where vast swaths labeled Terra Incognita conveniently overlapped with ancestral indigenous homelands. These weren't oversights, they were erasures. By scrubbing native cities, roads, and farms from the parchment, mapmakers didn't just ignore civilizations, they declared them non-existent. The strategy reached its cruelest irony in Australia, where British colonizers wielded the Latin phrase Terra Nullius, land belonging to no one, like a legal sledgehammer. Never mind that Aboriginal Australians had thrived there for 65,000 years. Their sophisticated land management systems left no castles or cobblestones, so mapmakers dismissed them as nomads without territory. The empty spaces on those charts weren't just false, they were fatal. They became courtroom evidence, proving that colonization wasn't invasion but a benevolent gift of civilization to vacant wilderness. Even when indigenous peoples appeared on maps, they were framed as fleeting specters. Dutch maps of the Cape Colony showed San hunter-gatherers as tiny, scattered figures, more wildlife than society. Portuguese charts of Brazil depicted Tupi villages as temporary encampments. Their cultivated orchards and fishing weirs vanished from view. This visual downgrade turned millennia of stewardship into a passing shadow, making displacement seem inevitable rather than violent. But the most insidious trick, how these maps laundered theft as enlightenment. When European powers drew their versions of Africa in the 19th century, they sliced the continent into neat geometric colonies, borders slicing through ethnic groups and ecosystems alike. Native kingdoms vanished under the cartographer's pen, replaced by bold, clean lines that implied the land had been waiting for orderly European hands. It was geography as gaslighting, a wholesale rewrite of history where the conquerors became the creators. Today, we're left with the scars of those empty maps. Modern satellite imagery can show us the truth: indigenous fire management shaping landscapes, ancient trade routes still worn into the earth, but the old lies linger in property deeds and national myths. Every time someone calls a place discovered, they're echoing a 500-year-old trick of the pen, because the greatest power of a map isn't just showing what's there, it's convincing you of what was never allowed to exist. By the 19th century, maps had shed their religious costumes and donned the vibrant robes of nationalism, each border a battle cry, each city a shrine to sovereignty. Consider the schoolhouse maps of France and Germany, where the contested region of Alsace-Lorraine stretched or shrank depending on which side of the classroom you sat. French atlases painted it in bold, unbroken hues, seamlessly fused to their territory, while German versions branded it with Teutonic place names and iron cross-hatching. These weren't teaching aids, they were early indoctrination, where children learned their geography lessons with a side of jingoism. The brilliance of this cartographic patriotism lay in its subtlety. A river might bulge westward to imply natural boundaries favoring one nation. A rival's mountain range could be drawn with faint, jagged lines, as if apologizing for its existence. Even colors conspired in the charade. British maps drenched their empire in reassuring pink, while Russian charts drowned Eastern Europe in vast imperial green. The message was visceral. Our land is vibrant, whole, inevitable. Theirs is fractured, fading, conditional. Schools became the front line of this silent war. In Italy, post-unification textbooks featured maps where the peninsula gleamed as a single entity, its former city-states erased like pencil marks. Hungarian classrooms displayed maps of Greater Hungary, its pre-World War I borders lingering like phantom limbs, stoking irredentist dreams in generations too young to remember the loss. Geography exams didn't just test knowledge, they policed loyalty. A student who marked Trieste as Austrian rather than Italian might lose marks, not for inaccuracy, but for ideological impurity. Yet the most potent trick was how these distortions masqueraded as objectivity. Unlike medieval maps flaunting their religious bias, nationalist cartographers leaned on the newfound prestige of science. Grid lines, precise scales, and Latinate legends lent their work an air of impartiality. When a German atlas claimed the Rhine as Germany's river, not Germany's border, it did so with crisp typography and surveyed coordinates, making myth feel like mathematics. Today, we see echoes of this in every disputed map, whether it's China's 9-dash line, swallowing the South China Sea, or Indian and Pakistani textbooks showing Kashmir in clashing shades. The tools have modernized, but the game hasn't changed. Wield a map long enough, and you can convince people that fiction is fate. After all, what's a border but a line someone drew, and a nation but a story everyone agreed to believe? The Silk Road wasn't just a highway of goods, it was a labyrinth of lies, where every map was a decoy and every route a carefully guarded secret. Picture a Persian merchant unfurling a parchment for a visiting trader, his finger tracing a path that conveniently bypassed the most water-rich oases. To the outsider, it looked like generosity, a shared guide to the desert's perils. In truth, it was a masterclass in misdirection, a way to funnel rivals into the dunes while the real treasure path stayed hidden. These weren't innocent omissions, they were acts of economic warfare. Arab cartographers, for instance, would shrink the size of critical way stations like Samarkand or Palmyra on their maps, making them appear as mere specks in the wilderness. The goal, to downplay their importance, ensuring rival caravans would underestimate their supplies and overextend themselves. A single missing oasis on a map could mean the difference between a merchant empire's fortune and a competitor's collapse in the sands. But the deception ran deeper than just sand and ink. Chinese silk traders went so far as to invent entire mountain ranges on their charts, creating imaginary barriers that scared off would-be competitors. The message was clear: this road belongs to us and the dangers are too great for outsiders. It was geography as a gatekeeper, where the right to trade came with knowing which lines to trust and which were pure fiction. What's fascinating is how these lies were woven into the fabric of diplomacy. When a Mongol Khan received a map from a Persian envoy, he wasn't just being shown geography, he was being tested. Would he recognize the gaps, the subtle erasures? Could he read between the lines to find the unmarked wells that spelled survival? Those who passed the test gained access to the Silk Road's true veins, those who failed were left to wander the scripted fiction. Even the famed Catalan Atlas, a medieval masterpiece, played this game. Its dazzling illustrations of camel caravans and golden cities distracted from its deliberate silences entire stretches of the Sahara rendered as empty voids, when in reality they pulsed with hidden trade networks. The maps weren't guides, they were filters, separating the privileged from the expendable. Today, we see echoes of this in everything from corporate trade secrets to classified shipping lanes. The players have changed, but the rules remain. Control the map and you control the wealth. So the next time you marvel at an ancient trade route, ask yourself what's not drawn here. Because the blank spaces were never empty, they were the most valuable real estate of all. Off the edge of the known world, where the parchment faded into blank mystery, medieval cartographers unleashed their most fearsome weapons, not swords or cannons, but sea monsters. These weren't doodles in the margins, they were calculated deterrents, inked with political precision. When Portugal's royal mapmakers sketched colossal serpents coiling around the Cape of Good Hope, they weren't documenting wildlife. They were planting a psychic fence, warning rival ships, venture here, and the ocean itself will devour you. Consider the Carta Marina, a 16th century masterpiece where the North Atlantic seethes with tentacled horrors. One creature near Iceland bears a face eerily human, its jaws wide enough to swallow galleons whole. Another, off Norway, stabs ships with its spiked tail like a child popping toy boats. To modern eyes, these seem like whimsical fantasies, but to the kings of Spain and Portugal, they were as strategic as any fortress wall. By saturating uncharted waters with nightmares, they turned geography into a psychological battleground where fear did the work of fleets. The genius lay in the ambiguity. No one could prove the monsters didn't exist. Sailors returned with tales of giant squids or rogue waves, and mapmakers seized those fragments to weave grander myths. A ripple became a sea dragon, a whale's spout transformed into a demon's breath. When Portugal labeled the southern Atlantic, "Here be Leviathans," they weren't lying, they were weaponizing doubt. Why risk a voyage when the maps themselves screamed danger? Even the church played along. Clergy-approved charts framed the deep ocean as God's testing ground, where only the righteous might survive. A bishop blessing a map adorned with krakens wasn't endorsing fantasy. He was sanctifying a colonial moat. Every monstrous illustration served dual purposes, frightening competitors while justifying conquest as divine destiny. After all, if heathen seas bred such abominations, didn't Christian nations have a duty to tame them? Yet the darkest twist, some of these creatures had corporate sponsors. The famed sea swine, on Dutch maps a bloated, tusked horror, appeared suspiciously along trade routes the Dutch East India Company wanted to monopolize. Coincidence? Hardly. These weren't just maps, they were prospectuses for investors where danger signs doubled as marketing. A monster here meant fewer competitors, higher spice prices, and safer profits. Today, we've swapped ink for pixels, but the tactic endures. Modern charts still mark military exclusion zones with ominous red shading, while undersea cables and oil rigs hide behind bureaucratic jargon as impenetrable as any medieval Latin warning. The monsters have shed their scales, but their purpose remains to keep the unwanted at bay. So the next time you see a "Here be dragons" on an old map, remember, it wasn't ignorance. It was the oldest trick in the book. When you can't guard the territory, let the legend do it for you. The mapmakers of the Cold War didn't need sea monsters to wage their battles. They had something far more insidious, the veneer of scientific accuracy. On the surface, Soviet atlases of the 1950s looked like models of precision, their crisp lines and uniform fonts projecting impartial authority. But peer closer and the deception unfolded. West Berlin, a capitalist island deep in East German territory, would appear shrunken, its borders faint as if fading from existence. Meanwhile, the vast expanse of the USSR sprawled across the page in bold, unbroken strokes, its republics fused together like an immutable fact of nature. These weren't mistakes, they were visual propaganda, reinforcing the myth of socialist unity while whispering that Western enclaves were temporary, insignificant, already dissolving into history's dustbin. Across the Iron Curtain, American cartographers played the same game with inverted motives. CIA-funded school maps exaggerated the size of the Eastern Bloc, painting communist territory in ominous red that bled across continents. A child glancing at these charts didn't just see countries. They saw contagion, a creeping shadow threatening to swallow the free world. The Mercator projection, already distorting the globe to inflate northern latitudes, made the USSR loom even larger, its landmass dwarfing the United States. Fear, after all, was the most effective compass, and nothing steered public opinion like a map that made danger look closer than it really was. But the real masterstroke was how these distortions survived the space age. By the 1960s, spy satellites could photograph every inch of the planet, yet the lies persisted in textbooks and newsrooms. Soviet encyclopedias quietly redrew rivers to justify territorial claims, while U.S. media maps erased entire socialist infrastructure projects, depicting the Eastern Bloc as a barren wasteland. The message was clear: facts might be observable, but truth was negotiable. A border wasn't just a line, it was an argument, a dare, a story waiting to be rewritten. Perhaps the most chilling example was the Sino-Soviet split. As China and the USSR teetered toward conflict in the late 1960s, their maps performed acrobatics of denial. Soviet charts minimized the length of their shared border, as if downplaying proximity could diffuse tensions. Chinese atlases, meanwhile, began labeling Outer Mongolia with its ancient name, subtly staking claim to what had been Soviet-aligned territory for decades. These weren't navigational aids, they were opening moves in a geopolitical chess match, where every millimeter of ink carried the weight of divisions and missiles. What's haunting is how these tactics seeped into everyday life. East German students learned one set of borders, West Germans memorized another. Families separated by the Iron Curtain might own identical atlases, same publisher, same year, only to find their hometowns placed in different nations depending on which side printed them. The maps didn't just reflect division, they manufactured it, turning shared geography into a battleground of incompatible truths. And then, with a speed that would make any cartographer dizzy, the whole facade collapsed. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, outdated maps became instant relics. Suddenly, the eternal USSR could be wiped clean with a printer's correction fluid, its republics snapping into independence like rubber bands stretched too far. But the lesson lingered. No matter how precise the tools, maps remain clay in the hands of those who rule. Today, as digital platforms let anyone remap the world with a click, the old games have simply gone viral. The monsters may have changed, but the parchment is still a battlefield. To walk through an Egyptian temple was to step inside a living map, one where the gods themselves had drawn the borders. Pharaohs didn't just rule territory, they presided over a cosmic blueprint where every inch of land was infused with divine intention. Take the Turin Papyrus, a 3,000-year-old map of gold mines in the eastern desert. At first glance, it's a practical guide to mineral wealth, but look closer. The Nile isn't just a river, it's a radiant spine, splitting the world into sacred symmetry. To the west, neat grids mark orderly Egyptian settlements. To the east, the terrain dissolves into jagged chaos where foreign tribes lurk like shadows. This wasn't cartography, it was theology in ink. The genius of these maps lay in their circular logic. By depicting Egypt as the gods' chosen land, a perfect rectangle of fertile black soil framed by the red land of desert, they made foreign conquests seem like acts of cosmic cleanup. When Ramses II commissioned maps showing his victories in Nubia, the conquered lands weren't just added territory, they were blank spaces being returned to order, like scattered puzzle pieces snapping back into place. The message was clear: expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. Even the Nile's famous floods were weaponized in these designs. Temple murals showed the river as a shimmering serpent, its coils cradling cities while foreign rivers twisted weakly in the margins. By exaggerating the Nile's breadth and straightening its curves, mapmakers didn't just celebrate their lifeline, they implied it was the only river that mattered. Others might flow, but the Nile flowed with purpose, carrying the will of the gods. But the most audacious trick, how these maps erased time itself. Egyptian boundary stelae, carved stone maps marking empire edges, placed pharaohs shoulder to shoulder with deities, their names etched alongside eternal hieroglyphs. A foreign king might build a fortress, but an Egyptian pharaoh built eternity. His borders weren't penciled in, they were chiseled into the fabric of creation, as permanent as the stars. Today, we see echoes of this in every national myth that calls a homeland promised or chosen. The tools have changed, but the instinct remains. Wrap your borders in the sacred, and suddenly, holding them isn't politics, it's piety. So the next time someone claims their land is blessed by history or heaven, remember the pharaohs. They wrote the playbook, and it's older than the pyramids. If you've ever looked at a world map and thought Greenland was nearly the size of Africa, you've fallen victim to one of history's most enduring cartographic tricks, the Mercator projection. Created in 1569 by Flemish geographer Gerardus Mercator, this map wasn't designed to deceive. It was meant to help sailors navigate straight-line courses across the oceans. But the unintended consequences reshaped how entire generations saw power on a global scale. By stretching landmasses near the poles and shrinking those near the equator, Mercator's math made Europe appear absurdly dominant, a bloated monarch presiding over a diminished world. Take Africa, a continent 14 times larger than Greenland in reality. On a Mercator map, they look almost interchangeable. India, home to 1/6 of humanity, shrinks into a teardrop beside the exaggerated bulk of Scandinavia. These weren't minor discrepancies, they were visual propaganda reinforcing the idea that temperate zones and the empires that ruled them were the natural centers of gravity. When British schoolchildren memorized their pink-colored empire sprawling across the globe, they weren't just learning geography. They were absorbing a hierarchy where the civilized world loomed large and the tropics faded into backdrop. The real scandal, nobody fixed it. Long after sailors stopped relying on Mercator's room lines, the projection clung to classroom walls, atlases, and even digital maps. Its distortions became so familiar that they felt true. Generations grew up believing Canada was genuinely larger than South America, that Russia deserved its gargantuan presence on the map. The effect was psychological colonization, a quiet convincing that some lands mattered more simply because they took up more space on paper. Modern critiques often miss the subtle brilliance of this bias. It wasn't just about size, it was about orientation. By placing Europe at the center and the global south at the bottom, Mercator's map implied a natural order. Wealthy nations floated prominently at eye level, while former colonies seemed to sag downward, as if weighed down by their own insignificance. Even the colors conspired cartographers often used pale, washed-out hues for Africa and Asia, while Europe gleamed in bold emerald and gold. Yet the most insidious legacy isn't on paper, it's in our minds. Studies show people still underestimate the wealth, population, and cultural output of equatorial regions, their mental maps forever warped by Mercator's ghost. When you grow up seeing your country as small, you start seeing yourself as small. That's the power of a line drawn in the 16th century. It can shrink continents, shift perspectives, and linger in the imagination long after the maps themselves fade away. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer land, it conquered knowledge. In the halls of Topkapi Palace, where sultans plotted their next campaign, the most prized treasures weren't just jewels or weapons, but maps. Intricately drawn on gazelle skin or silk, these charts didn't just depict the empire, they curated it. Ottoman cartographers mastered the art of selective precision, rendering their own cities in exquisite detail: minarets, bazaars, even individual caravanserais, while rival territories dissolved into hazy outlines, as if the world itself grew uncertain beyond the reach of the Sultan's authority. This wasn't laziness, it was strategy. By monopolizing accurate geography, the Ottomans turned maps into instruments of psychological dominance. A Venetian merchant seeking trade routes through Anatolia might receive a lavishly illustrated map, but one where critical mountain passes blurred into decorative flourishes, or where friendly Armenian towns gleamed with gold leaf while hostile Safavid strongholds faded into the parchment like ghosts. The message was clear: venture where we guide you, or risk vanishing into the unknown. The system reached its zenith with the empire's legendary secrecy. Top-tier maps were classified state documents, guarded like military plans. Foreign ambassadors requesting copies were handed beautifully flawed replicas, versions where distances between Ottoman forts were subtly altered, or where rivers took improbable turns. Even the famed Piri Reis map, celebrated for its accuracy, was rumored to have deliberate omissions. After all, why share the true contours of the Black Sea when a few strategic errors could strand rival navies in dead ends? But the real power lay in the illusion of completeness. By producing maps so stunning in craftsmanship, inked in lapis lazuli, gilded with real gold, the Ottomans made their partial truths feel absolute. A European diplomat squinting at an Ottoman atlas wouldn't see the gaps. He'd see a civilization so confident in its mastery that it could afford to leave its rivals as afterthoughts. The maps didn't just hide information, they flaunted the luxury of withholding it. What's startling is how modern this game feels. Today's tech giants hoard data like Ottoman scribes hoarded coastlines, and nations still manipulate digital maps to obscure military bases or redraw contested borders. The tools have digitized, but the principle remains: control the map and you control the narrative. So the next time you zoom in on a map and hit a blurry patch, ask yourself, is this a technical glitch, or is someone's hand still at work, editing reality one pixel at a time? For over 200 years, Japan's shores didn't just resist foreign ships, they vanished from the maps entirely. Edo period cartographers crafted a world where the archipelago floated in serene isolation, its coastlines impeccably drawn while the surrounding seas dissolved into empty expanses. When foreign vessels did appear, usually Dutch or Chinese traders restricted to tiny artificial islands like Dejima, they were rendered as distant specks, floating so far offshore they might as well have been in another realm. This wasn't accidental omission, it was policy in ink. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't just close Japan, it rewrote the rules of geography to match. Official maps, like the exquisite Nihonban Keizu, framed the nation as a self-contained universe, its mountains and rivers flowing in perfect harmony while the outside world crumpled at the edges like discarded parchment. Even compass roses pointed inward, their delicate arms curling toward Kyoto and Edo as if the very winds conspired to keep outsiders lost. The message was unmistakable. Japan wasn't just separate, it was complete. But the true genius lay in how these maps weaponized aesthetics. A Dutch trader's ship might be drawn as a clumsy, exaggerated caricature, its sails billowing like a monster's wings, while Japanese fishing boats glided gracefully along the coastlines in precise, elegant lines. The contrast wasn't subtle. Foreignness equaled disorder. Japanese space hummed with disciplined beauty. It was a visual mantra, reinforcing the Sakoku edicts that banned citizens from leaving and outsiders from entering on pain of death. The most revealing detail, these maps weren't secret. They hung in tea houses, circulated among merchants, even guided domestic travel. By saturating everyday life with this curated geography, the shogunate didn't just enforce isolation, they made it feel natural. A farmer studying a map to visit Kyoto didn't see a censored world. He saw a world where nothing of value existed beyond the waves. The empty seas weren't a warning, they were a comfort. Yet the irony cuts deep. While Japan's maps erased the outside world, Dutch traders secretly smuggled in European charts, their precise coastlines and trade routes hidden beneath floorboards. Two geographies coexisted, one for show, one for survival. And when American warships finally breached the illusion in 1853, their black hulls didn't just shatter isolation. They exposed the fragility of a nation that had spent centuries drawing its own reality. Today, we see echoes of this in every firewall and closed border. The instinct to redraw the world until it fits our fears, because the lesson of Edo's maps isn't just about isolation. It's about how easily lines on paper can become walls in the mind. Behind the thick walls of the Vatican's secret archives, locked away from even the most devout pilgrims, lay a treasure more valuable than relics, the world's most accurate maps. While ordinary believers navigated by distorted charts showing Jerusalem as the center of creation, the Church's inner circle studied precise coordinates, trade routes, and even the hidden paths of rival faiths. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was a masterclass in spiritual cartography. By controlling geography, the Vatican didn't just guide souls, it corralled them. Take the Via Francigena, the famed medieval pilgrimage route to Rome. Public maps exaggerated its dangers, banned it infested forests, treacherous rivers, while downplaying alternative paths. Yet in the archives, scribes kept meticulous records of safer, faster routes, shared only with trusted abbots and bishops. The result, pilgrims funneled into controlled corridors, their journeys funneling wealth into church coffers at designated monasteries and shrines. A traveler who strayed from the official path didn't just risk getting lost, he risked his salvation, venturing beyond the mapped grace of God. The deception reached its peak with the Hereford Map Mystique public copies. While the original displayed real caravan routes to the Holy Land, the versions distributed to parish churches erased them, replacing factual geography with moral fables. A merchant might know the quickest way to Jerusalem, but the church's map showed only the virtuous path, a meandering gauntlet of tithe-collecting cathedrals. The lesson was clear: stray from our lines and you stray from God's plan. But the Vatican's greatest power wasn't hiding the truth, it was defining it. When Portuguese explorers returned with maps proving Earth's vastness, the archives quietly updated their charts while public teaching still preached a small, Jerusalem-centric world. Faithful cartographers who dared contradict the approved geography faced charges of heresy. Their maps burned as dangerously confusing to the pious. The Church didn't just own the maps, it owned reality itself. What's chilling is how these tactics echo today. When modern pilgrims follow apps marking official routes to Santiago de Compostela or Lourdes, they're walking paths curated by algorithms, digital heirs to the Vatican's gatekeeping. The players have changed, but the game remains. Control the map and you control the journey. because the most powerful lies aren't the ones hidden in vaults, they're the ones everyone accepts as truth. Napoleon understood something most conquerors forget: victories aren't just won with cannons and cavalry, but with ink and parchment. His cartographers didn't merely document his empire, they performed plastic surgery on it. After the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, where frostbite and starvation decimated his Grande Armée, official French maps didn't show retreating soldiers trudging through snow. They showed gleaming new roads radiating from Paris like sunbeams, as if every muddy path in Poland had been paved by imperial decree. Cities captured in fleeting victories ballooned to twice their size, while towns where his forces faced humiliation were reduced to faint dots if they appeared at all. The brilliance of this deception lay in its subtlety. Unlike medieval maps flaunting their religious bias, Napoleon's charts wore the mask of scientific precision. They used the same clean lines, the same elegant fonts as genuine military surveys, just with the inconvenient facts airbrushed away. A general studying one of these maps would see the Pyrenees neatly labeled, the Rhine crisply defined, but the blood-soaked fields of Waterloo. Those might as well have slipped off the edge of the earth. It was geography as gaslighting, where the emperor's vision became the only reality that mattered. Even his defeats got the cartographic makeover treatment. After the Battle of Leipzig, a catastrophic loss that shattered his grip on Germany, Napoleon's team produced maps where French positions were still marked in bold blue, while the encircling Allied armies dissolved into vague smudges. The paper whispered what the battlefield screamed: we are not retreating, we are strategically pivoting. These weren't tools for navigation. They were press releases in topographical form, designed to keep his subjects believing in invincibility even as the empire crumbled. The most audacious trick: how these maps weaponized time. By dating them months before actual battles, Napoleon created an alternate timeline where his claims predated reality. A city captured in October might appear as French territory on a map printed in July, making the eventual occupation seem inevitable rather than desperate. The parchment didn't follow the war was expected to catch up to the parchment. Yet the irony cuts deep. While Napoleon obsessed over these paper conquests, his enemies were using accurate British-made maps to outmaneuver him. The very precision he dismissed as pedantry became the rope that hanged his ambitions. Today, those vanity maps gather dust in archives, their grandiose lies preserved under glass, a reminder that no matter how boldly you redraw the world, reality always keeps its own borders. The royal road of the Persian Empire didn't just connect cities, it sold a story. Stretching over 2,400 kilometers from Sardis to Susa, this ancient highway was a marvel of engineering, but its true power lay in the myths woven into its maps. Persian couriers boasted they could traverse the entire route in just 7 days, a claim that sent shudders through rival kingdoms. The reality: even the fastest riders needed closer to 3 weeks. Yet by exaggerating the speed and seamlessness of their network, the Persians didn't just move messages, they moved fear. Carved into clay tablets and etched onto leather scrolls, official Persian maps depicted the royal road as a razor-straight artery, its rest stations spaced like clockwork. Foreign spies who stole these charts saw a realm where orders flashed across deserts and mountains with supernatural efficiency. What the maps omitted: the grueling switchbacks where horses foundered, the seasonal floods that swallowed entire stretches, the bandit-haunted passes where even imperial messengers rode with drawn swords. The deception was deliberate. A road drawn perfectly was a road that felt unconquerable. The genius of this cartographic theater was how it played on psychological time. When Greek merchants received Persian itineraries promising a 12-day journey to the capital, only to slog through 20, they didn't blame the maps, they blamed themselves. Surely the Persians knew some secret shortcuts, some divine favor that eluded outsiders. The road became less a path than a propaganda piece, its imagined efficiency amplifying the empire's aura of inevitability. Even the way stations were part of the illusion. Official maps showed hundreds of identical caravanserais, each marked with the imperial sun symbol, implying flawless imperial control. In truth, many were ramshackle outposts run by bribable locals, but by presenting the system as a monolithic machine, the Persians turned rest stops into psychological milestones, every crumbling stable another proof of their omnipresence. The ultimate trick, how these maps framed distance as discipline, where Babylonian or Egyptian charts might note natural landmarks, a sacred grove, a winding river. Persian road maps reduced geography to numbers. Parasang 23, water and grain. The message was clear. This land had been measured, mastered, and boiled down to logistics. A kingdom that could turn mountains into mileage markers wasn't just powerful, it was rewriting the rules of space itself. Today, we see echoes of this in every subway map that straightens chaotic tunnels or app that promises impossibly fast delivery times. The players have changed, but the game remains. Control the perception of distance, and you control the perception of power. Because the fastest route isn't always the one on the ground, sometimes it's the one drawn in the mind. When the Aztec emperor gazed upon the maps of Tenochtitlan, he didn't just see a city, he saw the universe in miniature. At the heart of every parchment lay the sacred Templo Maya, its twin pyramids representing the sun and moon, anchoring the world like a celestial axis. Radiating outward in precise geometric patterns were canals, causeways, and tributary roads, each line a thread in the empire's grand design. This wasn't urban planning, it was theology in stone and water, a cartographic sermon declaring that power didn't just flow from the throne, it pulsed through the very landscape. The genius of these maps lay in their layered deception. To subject cities, they were presented as acts of generosity, a shared blueprint showing their place in a harmonious cosmic order. But look closer, and the hierarchy became undeniable. Tenochtitlan's central precincts were drawn with meticulous detail, every temple and plaza gleaming with gold leaf, while outlying regions faded into schematic simplicity. The closer a city appeared to the center, the richer its depiction, the farther away, the more it blurred into symbolic submission. Distance wasn't measured in miles but in prestige, with every kilometer from the capital a step down the ladder of existence. Even nature conspired in this illusion. Maps depicted the lake surrounding Tenochtitlan as a perfect circle, its waters calm and obedient, when in reality it was a patchwork of marshes and unpredictable currents. The 5 tributary rivers feeding it were drawn as straight, equal spokes, never mind that some ran dry in summer or flooded violently in monsoon season. Geography wasn't recorded, it was disciplined, forced into shapes that mirrored Aztec ideals of balance and control. A crooked river couldn't serve an empire that worshipped symmetry, so the maps made it straight. But the most potent trick was how these designs weaponized sacred geometry. The 4 cardinal directions weren't just orientations, they were portals to different realms, each governed by gods whose favor the Aztecs claimed exclusively. By aligning conquered cities along these cosmic axes, the maps implied a divine endorsement of tribute. Resistance wasn't just rebellion, it was cosmic disorder, a tearing of the universe's fabric. When a distant province hesitated to send its gold or feathers, Aztec envoys would unroll these maps, pointing to the empty spaces where rebellious lands simply ceased to exist. The message was clear: defy the center and you erase yourself from creation. Yet the irony was as sharp as an obsidian blade. While Aztec maps portrayed tributary states as passive recipients of Tenochtitlan's glory, Spanish chronicles tell a different story. Local rulers often kept their own maps hidden, folded in bark paper, where their cities loomed large with Tenochtitlan reduced to a tiny marker. The lake's treacherous currents were noted in detail, its islands labeled as sanctuaries for escape. These were maps of quiet defiance, proof that the conquered never fully surrendered their vision of the world. Today, we see echoes of this in every capital city's monumentality, every highway system that makes the periphery feel distant. The Aztecs understood what modern planners know instinctively. A map is never just a guide. It's an argument, a spell, a way to make power feel as inevitable as the sunrise. So the next time you trace a route on your phone, ask yourself whose universe are you navigating and what worlds might be hiding just beyond the edges of the screen. The British Empire didn't just draw borders, it designed fractures. When colonial administrators sliced through continents with ruler straight lines, they weren't solving disputes, they were engineering them. Take the Durand Line, scratched onto parchment in 1893 to separate British India from Afghanistan. This arbitrary slash through Pashtun homelands didn't follow rivers or mountain ranges. It ignored them, cleaving villages in half and turning neighbors into foreigners overnight. The goal wasn't accuracy but control, a divide and rule tactic disguised as cartography where chaos became the empire's quiet ally. Africa suffered even cruder surgery. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, European powers carved the continent like a cake, their pens slicing through ethnic groups, trade networks, and ancient kingdoms without a single African voice in the room. The result, borders that made colonial accounting easy but human life impossible. The Nigeria-Cameroon line split the Bakassi people's fishing grounds. The Congo's geometric edges boxed rival clans into explosive proximity. These weren't mistakes, they were pressure valves ensuring newly independent nations would remain too busy fighting internal fires to challenge their former masters. Yet the most insidious legacy lies in the paperwork. British surveyors didn't just misdraw borders, they weaponized documentation. Tribal maps were redrawn to exaggerate divisions, with subtle shading implying some groups belonged while others were interlopers. Census categories invented ethnic hierarchies where none existed, then cemented them in official atlases. A colonial officer's scribble could turn pastoralists into trespassers on their own ancestral grazing lands, all while the maps bore the reassuring stamp of scientific survey. The consequences still detonate today. Kashmir's jagged edges, drawn by a British lawyer over brandy in 1947, fuel nuclear standoffs. The Middle East Sykes-Picot borders, drafted in secret during World War I, birthed ISIS' rallying cry to erase the line. Even Africa's deadliest conflicts, from Biafra to Darfur, trace their fault lines back to some colonial clerk's hasty pen strokes. But here's the twist: the British knew exactly what they were doing. Declassified memos reveal administrators boasting how ungovernable borders would keep post-colonial states dependent on London's mediation. The maps weren't failures of planning, they were its perverse perfection. When you can't hold an empire forever, you leave behind a geography that holds its people hostage. Today, as drones patrol these same artificial frontiers, we're left with a chilling lesson. The most dangerous borders aren't drawn in sand or ink, but in the mind. Once people believe a line is real no matter how arbitrary, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of division. The British Empire may have faded, but its greatest illusion endures, that these lines were ever meant to be crossed. The Ming Dynasty didn't just build the Great Wall, they built a myth. Behind the towering ramparts and watchtowers lay a secret the emperors would kill to protect. The wall wasn't impregnable. It had gaps, crumbling sections, and entire stretches where nomadic horsemen could slip through like shadows. But you'd never know it from the maps. Imperial cartographers were ordered to produce only perfect versions, sleek, unbroken lines snaking across mountains in bold strokes of vermilion ink. These weren't navigation tools, they were theater props in a grand performance of invincibility. Consider the fate of the Wanli Emperor's court cartographer in 1598. After secretly sketching a map marking weak points near the Gobi Desert, he was caught and executed, his work burned alongside him. From that day forward, official maps showed the wall as a seamless dragon spine, its stones fused together by celestial will. Reality was too dangerous. If Mongol chieftains or rebellious generals saw the cracks, they might realize the empire's armor was brittle. Better to let them stare at flawless parchment and tremble. The genius of this deception was how it exploited the wall's sheer scale. Stretching thousands of miles across impossible terrain, few could verify its true condition. A village mayor in Shaanxi might know his local section was crumbling, but the imperial map hanging in Beijing showed it gleaming and unbroken. Distance became the emperor's ally, turning skepticism into heresy. Who would dare claim the sacred maps lied when the truth required a months-long journey through bandit country? Even more cunning was how these maps framed geography as destiny. Weak points weren't erased, they were rewritten as features. A narrow pass vulnerable to cavalry raids became a choke point for annihilating invaders on the maps. Sections left unfinished due to corruption were labeled strategic pauses, as if the emperors had ordained gaps to lure enemies into traps. The lies weren't just hiding flaws, they were spinning them into legend. Yet the darkest twist lay in the duplicates. While provincial officials received the sanitized maps, the Forbidden City's inner circle studied accurate ones marked with red X's showing where bribes could buy a Mongol chieftain's silence or where extra troops should patrol before imperial inspections. The ruling elite didn't just know the truth, they weaponized it, using the gap between myth and reality to control both their enemies and their own people. Today, traces of this ancient con linger. Modern satellite images reveal the wall's missing bricks and eroded slopes, but tourist maps still echo the Ming aesthetic: unbroken, heroic, defiant. It's a reminder that the most enduring borders aren't made of stone, but of stories. And sometimes the greatest defense is simply convincing the world there was never anything to breach. Venetian merchants didn't just sail the Mediterranean, they rewrote it. Behind the gilded doors of the Doge's palace, cartographers crafted two versions of reality. One set of maps so precise they could trace the ripple of a single wave, and another so cunningly distorted they might as well have been fairy tales. The first, locked in velvet-lined cases, guided Venetian galleys through secret channels and sheltered coves. The second, slipped to Genos or Ottoman rivals, lured them onto shoals marked as deep water or into pirate-infested straits labeled safe passage. This wasn't just business, it was geographic sabotage where ink became as lethal as cannon fire. Take the infamous Map of the Four Winds, a masterpiece of deception. On the surface, it showed the Adriatic as a welcoming highway, with Venice's rival ports like Dubrovnik conveniently shrunk into insignificance, but the real treachery lay in the currents. Rival captains relying on this chart would find themselves fighting phantom tides, their ships dragged helplessly toward rocks that didn't appear on parchment until it was too late. Meanwhile, Venetian navigators knew the truth: the real maps marked submerged reefs with tiny crosses, invisible to the untrained eye but screaming danger to those in the know. The system thrived on Venetian control of another critical resource: pilots. Every foreign merchant entering the lagoon was required to hire a local guide who'd steer them using the falsified charts. These pilots weren't just experts, they were actors in an elaborate play, feigning frustration when their charges ran aground, as if the sea itself had betrayed them. The ruse was so convincing that for decades, rival cities blamed bad luck or divine wrath for their misfortunes, never suspecting the maps in their own hands were weapons. But the real stroke of genius, how Venice turned geography into a psychological game. By the 1500s, the mere rumor of a Venetian secret map was enough to paralyze competitors. Ottoman admirals would delay voyages for months, terrified their charts were poisoned. Genoese merchants paid exorbitant sums for what they believed were stolen true copies, only to find they'd bought another layer of lies. The Republic didn't just control trade routes, it seeded doubt so deep that rivals began second-guessing their own eyes, yet the darkest twist lay in the archives. When Venice's monopoly finally cracked in the 17th century, scholars discovered something astonishing: many of the false maps contained hidden accuracy. A misplaced island here, an exaggerated current there, but the bones of truth remained. The Republic hadn't just deceived its enemies, it had trained them to dismiss reality altogether. After generations of faulty maps, even when presented with genuine geography, rivals no longer trusted it. The ultimate cartographic trick wasn't drawing lies, it was making the truth seem like the lie. The ink-stained fingers of American surveyors didn't just draw borders, they performed disappearances. Long before wagon wheels crushed prairie grass underfoot, the United States Geological Survey maps were already wiping entire nations off the page. Vast regions where Cherokee farmers tended orchards or Lakota hunters followed buffalo migrations were labeled uninhabited wilderness, or worse, empty territory awaiting settlement. This wasn't ignorance, it was policy with a compass. By denying indigenous presence on paper, the young nation created a legal fiction where conquest became mere real estate transfer. Consider the infamous Mitchell Map of 1850, used to negotiate treaties and plan railroads. Its crisp lines showed neat territorial grids stretching to the Pacific, interrupted only by occasional cartoonish teepees hovering like mirages over unoccupied land. Never mind that census records documented thriving Potawatomi towns where Chicago would rise, or that Mandan earth lodges dotted the Missouri River basin. The mapmakers' pens transformed millennia of continuous habitation into a blank slate, ripe for the taking. The cruelty lay in the bureaucratic precision. Surveyors employed by the General Land Office didn't just omit native villages, they weaponized geography itself. When a region proved too populous to ignore, maps might grudgingly acknowledge Indian country, but always framed as temporary reserve land already fading from existence. Rivers were renamed, erasing indigenous hydrology. Mountain passes received new labels that honored generals rather than the tribes who'd navigated them for generations. It was ethnic cleansing by Erasure, where every stroke of the pen made displacement feel inevitable. Even more insidious were the land speculation maps. Auction catalogs for westward expansion showed parcels colored in inviting greens and yellows, with not a single native structure marring the pastoral fantasy. Investors in Boston and New York could peruse these documents over brandy, imagining their future wheat fields, never suspecting those vacant plots were actually Shawnee cornfields or Nez Perce fishing grounds. The deception was so thorough that when settlers finally arrived, they genuinely believed they were pioneers rather than invaders. Yet the most devastating impact wasn't on the settlers, but on the tribes themselves. Federal negotiators would unroll these falsified maps during treaty talks, pointing to the empty spaces as proof that ancestral lands were up for grabs. A Creek leader might gesture toward his people's burial mounds visible through the tent flap, only to be shown a government chart where that very spot appeared as unclaimed federal territory. The message was clear: reality didn't matter, only what appeared on the official parchment held weight. Today, digital archives reveal the shocking contrast between these maps and reality. Overlay an 1835 survey with modern archaeological data, and suddenly the wilderness teems with indigenous infrastructure trails worn 6 feet deep by countless moccasins, irrigation canals feeding squash gardens, quarry sites where toolmakers worked for centuries. The blank spaces were never empty, they were redacted. What makes this cartographic violence so haunting is how it still echoes in our collective memory. When modern Americans picture the untamed frontier, they're seeing through the surveyor's lies. The true landscape wasn't vacant, it was vetoed from history with a draftsman's pen. And once a people are erased from the map, it becomes that much easier to erase them from the story altogether. Constantinople's walls didn't just defy invaders, they lied to them. While the Theodosian fortifications stood as physical marvels, the city's true secret weapon was its maps, carefully crafted illusions designed to turn even the most seasoned generals into lost, frustrated fools. Byzantine emperors maintained 2 sets of charts, one for their engineers, showing the real vulnerabilities of the landward walls, and another for leaking to enemies, littered with phantom gates, exaggerated weak points, and entirely fictional siege routes. It was psychological warfare disguised as cartography, where the greatest defense wasn't stone but skepticism. Take the infamous Leo's Delusion, a map circulated ahead of the Arab siege of 717. It depicted a sprawling network of underground aqueducts leading straight into the city's heart, tunnels that didn't exist. For months, Caliph Maslama's forces wasted precious time and lives digging where the parchment promised passage, only to hit solid bedrock. Meanwhile, the real aqueducts critical to Constantinople's survival were omitted entirely, their locations known only to a handful of palace hydrologists. The Arabs weren't just fighting the Byzantines, they were chasing ghosts inked onto vellum. The deception ran deeper than fake tunnels. Official maps given to Venetian allies showed the seawalls as impossibly high, their foundations plunging deep below the waves. In reality, the Marmara defenses were vulnerable at certain tides, a fact Byzantine admirals guarded like state secrets. When the Fourth Crusade approached in 1204, their commanders hesitated for weeks, terrified of the illusory cliffs on their charts. By the time they realized the truth, the city had rallied its defenses. The delay cost the Crusaders their advantage and handed Constantinople precious time. But the masterstroke was how these lies were framed as truths. Byzantine mapmakers didn't just invent features, they salted their forgeries with enough accuracy to be believable. A real gate might appear slightly off position, or a legitimate bastion could be drawn with exaggerated cracks. The goal wasn't to create total fiction, but plausible doubt, enough to make invaders second-guess every assault. Even when spies smuggled out genuine sketches, commanders assumed they were yet another layer of misdirection. After generations of deceit, the only map anyone trusted was the one the Byzantines wanted them to see. The irony, some of these false weak points became self-fulfilling prophecies. A wall section repeatedly marked as fragile on decoy maps might attract disproportionate attacks, wearing it down until it actually needed repair. The Byzantines turned this to their advantage, preemptively reinforcing areas they'd labeled as targets. By the time enemies realized they'd been played, the city had already adapted its defenses, evolving faster than any siege engine could breach them. Today, archaeologists still uncover traces of this cartographic chess game. A Venetian merchant's diary mentions a smuggled map showing a golden gate near the Blasciani Palace, a gate that never existed. Ottoman archives describe sultans receiving contradictory charts from Byzantine defectors, each contradicting the last. The walls may have fallen eventually, but the strategy lived on. Modern militaries still employ honeypot maps, feeding false terrain data to drones or hackers, because the lesson of Constantinople isn't just about guarding gates, it's about weaponizing the very idea of truth. Sometimes the best way to protect a city is to convince the world it was never there to begin with. Nazi cartographers didn't just draw borders, they weaponized victimhood. In the years leading up to World War II, German schools and newspapers were flooded with maps drenched in emotional propaganda, each one transforming geography into grievance. Vibrant red splotches labeled Deutschtum Germanness sprawled across Europe, deliberately fractured by jagged black lines representing the hated Treaty of Versailles. A single glance told the story Berlin wanted its people to believe. Proud German communities were trapped behind artificial barriers, suffocating under foreign rule. The maps didn't just depict territory, they scripted a rescue mission. Take the infamous Volkstamscart of Czechoslovakia, circulated in 1938. Tiny German settlements near the Sudetenland were inflated into sprawling cultural hubs, while Czech towns shrank into specks. Contour lines bent unnaturally to make the region appear physically tethered to Germany, as if geography itself yearned for reunification. The accompanying text screamed of Czech oppression. Schools closed, language banned, traditions crushed, claims often exaggerated or outright fabricated. Yet the maps made them feel visceral. When Hitler demanded the Sudetenland at Munich, Western diplomats weren't just looking at political demands, they were staring at a cartographic sob story, meticulously crafted to justify invasion. The genius, if such a word can be used, lay in how these maps hijacked the language of science. Colored with precise ethnographic data and gridded with authoritative coordinates, they mimicked academic atlases to lend bigotry credibility. A teacher pointing to a scientific map showing German farmers encircled by Slavic neighbors wasn't spreading hate, he was delivering a geography lesson. By the time the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland in 1939, millions of Germans genuinely believed they were liberating kinsmen, not conquering neighbors. The maps had done their work, aggression reframed as humanitarian intervention. Even children's textbooks became tools of distortion. Coloring exercises asked students to free German territories by shading them in Reich red, turning geopolitics into a child's game. Puzzle maps showed pre-Versailles Germany as a wholesome whole, while post-war borders were depicted as a grotesque jigsaw, pieces violently torn away by shadowy foreign hands. The message was inescapable. What the world called invasion, Germans should call reunion, but the darkest innovation was temporal manipulation. Animated propaganda films used flashing maps to show German lands bleeding over time, their borders shrinking under supposed Allied strangulation. No context was given for why these changes occurred, no mention of lost wars or colonial ambitions, just an endless loop of cartographic amputation designed to trigger primal rage. By the time Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss, many Austrians themselves had been convinced by these maps that they weren't a sovereign nation, but a severed limb begging to be reattached. The legacy of this deception still haunts modern cartography. Today's geopolitical conflicts from Crimea to Kashmir often play out with eerily similar maps, where shaded regions and selective history paint conquest as correction. Because the Nazis understood what every tyrant knows, show people a map often enough and they'll stop seeing the land. They'll see only the story you've drawn over it. And once that story feels like truth, even the most monstrous acts can be made to look like justice. During the Cold War, maps didn't just guide, they gaslit. NATO and Warsaw Pact cartographers turned entire landscapes into Hall of Mirrors, where rivers zigged where they should have zagged, and mountain passes materialized out of thin air. The most chilling example, West Germany's official road atlases, where bridges were subtly misaligned or erased entirely. To a Soviet tank commander racing toward the Rhine, these errors could mean the difference between a blitzkrieg advance and a convoy trapped in a bottleneck designed by pen and ink. Meanwhile, East German maps added phantom hills to the North European plain, non-existent elevations that, if targeted by NATO missiles, would send warheads harmlessly into empty fields. This wasn't just tinkering, it was institutionalized paranoia in topographical form. Soviet military maps of Western Europe exaggerated the width of autobahns, making them appear capable of handling tank columns 4 abreast when in reality they'd barely fit 2. The goal, to lure NATO into overestimating Warsaw Pact mobility, prompting wasteful spending on highway interdiction strategies. On the flip side, CIA-funded maps distributed in Eastern Europe showed Czechoslovak mountain ranges with suspiciously smooth slopes, implying easy passage for mechanized infantry. In reality, those passes were death traps of switchbacks, facts conveniently omitted to nudge Soviet planners toward disastrous routes. Even missile ranges got the cartographic makeover treatment. Public-facing Warsaw Pact atlases shrank the reported reach of SS-20 missiles by hundreds of kilometers, while NATO maps did the opposite, inflating Soviet capabilities to justify higher defense budgets. A Belgian farmer studying a government-issued civil defense map might see his village marked well inside a theoretical blast zone, while the same village on a Polish map would appear safely distant. The same geography, 2 irreconcilable truths and both lies. The genius of this deception lay in its bureaucratic banality. Unlike medieval maps flaunting their religious biases, Cold War distortions hid behind dry technical labels and sterile contour lines. A misplaced ridge here, an omitted rail junction there, nothing dramatic enough to trigger suspicion, but cumulatively lethal. East German railway maps, for instance, added fictitious spur lines near the border, which NATO planners might mistake for supply routes worth bombing. The real depots, camouflaged as farm silos on these same maps, would escape untouched. Most insidiously, these secret flaws were often hiding in plain sight. Warsaw Pact officers training with falsified NATO region maps grew so accustomed to the distortions that when they finally acquired genuine charts, they dismissed discrepancies as capitalist propaganda. The lies had become their own truth, a psychological victory before the first shot was fired. Today, declassified maps from both sides reveal the absurd scale of the charade. Overlay a Soviet map of Bavaria with satellite imagery, and suddenly highways veer off like drunk drivers. Compare NATO charts of Poland's river networks with hydrographic surveys, and watch entire tributaries evaporate. These weren't mistakes, they were minefields on paper where every misdrawn curve was a potential trap. Yet the darkest lesson lies in the aftermath. When the Berlin Wall fell, engineers rebuilding Eastern Europe's infrastructure stumbled upon bridges that didn't match any plans, tunnels unmarked on surveys, ghosts of the cartographic shadow war. Even peace couldn't erase decades of deliberate fiction, because when you weaponize maps, you don't just mislead armies, you fracture reality itself, leaving future generations to navigate a world half-drawn in lies. Today's digital maps may seem like the height of objectivity: crisp satellite images, real-time traffic updates, algorithms that learn your favorite coffee shop. But beneath that sleek interface, the same old games are being played with new tools. Google Maps might show one border while Apple Maps displays another, depending on which government pressured them last. A search for Palestine or Taiwan doesn't just return geography. It delivers a geopolitical stance coded in pixels. And it's not just borders. Entire neighborhoods can vanish or bloat based on who's paying to be seen. Take the case of Crimea in 2014. Overnight, Russian users saw the peninsula shaded as part of Russia, while Ukrainian devices displayed it as occupied territory. Neither version was wrong. In the strictest sense, both reflected the mapmaker's allegiance. Zoom in on the South China Sea, and you'll find China's 9-dash line subtly baked into some platforms, while others ignore it entirely. These aren't glitches, they're digital age cartographic diplomacy, where every zoom level is a negotiation, but the manipulation goes deeper than politics. Ever notice how your navigation app suddenly routes you past a certain chain restaurant or shopping center? Those detours aren't random, they're paid promotions disguised as convenience. Uber reportedly tweaked its maps to make drivers linger near high-profit areas, while delivery apps have been caught exaggerating the distance to independent restaurants to steer users toward corporate partners. The road you take isn't always the fastest, it's the one that makes someone the most money. Even the labels we take for granted are up for grabs. In 2019, Google was caught quietly scrubbing traditional Indigenous place names from maps of Canada, replacing them with colonial townships. Only after outcry did they restore the original terms buried in tiny font under the dominant labels. Meanwhile, in Australia, Aboriginal communities have fought to add sacred sites to digital maps, only to watch them get flagged as unverified or disappear entirely after algorithm updates. The message is clear: some histories get pinned, others get erased with a keystroke. The darkest trick: these distortions feel democratic because we can all add edits. But crowdsourcing has its own biases. Wealthy neighborhoods get meticulously detailed, every dog park and bike lane documented, while slums remain blurry blanks. A trendy cafe will have 50 glowing reviews pinpointing its location, but the migrant-run food cart around the corner, you'll need local knowledge to find it. The digital map doesn't just reflect inequality, it amplifies it one missing pin at a time. What makes this new era of manipulation so insidious is the illusion of choice. We think we're comparing neutral tools when we switch between Waze and Bing Maps, but each platform spins its own version of reality. Your phone might vibrate with a territorial alert near a disputed border, or your GPS might refuse to acknowledge a roadblock during a protest. The lines on your screen aren't just guides, they're arguments, shaped by boardrooms and bureaucrats you'll never meet. And here's the twist: we're complicit. Every time we blindly follow a reroute or accept the first search result, we reinforce these distortions. The old mapmakers had to convince kings and popes. Today's algorithms just need us to click accept. The parchment has been replaced by the pull-down menu, but the power plays, those haven't changed a bit. From clay tablets to GPS, maps have never been neutral. They're mirrors of power, reflecting who controls the narrative. Think about the last time you glanced at a map on your phone. It felt like pure science, didn't it? Pinpoint accuracy, real-time updates, no room for bias. But the truth is, every zoom, every label, every highlighted route is a choice, and choices are never innocent. Ancient kings distorted coastlines to flaunt their dominance. Today's algorithms nudge you toward sponsored gas stations or erase contested borders with a software update. The tools have changed, but the game hasn't. Consider how Google Maps decides what to name a place. In Jerusalem, the same street might appear as Pope's Way to one user and Han Nevium Road to another, depending on their location settings. It's not a glitch, it's a digital age echo of medieval mapmakers shading territories to match their patrons' claims. Or take the way navigation apps prioritize certain routes, funneling traffic through wealthy neighborhoods while leaving poorer areas disconnected. These aren't technical decisions, they're political ones dressed in the neutral language of ones and zeros. The most unsettling part, we've stopped questioning it. Ancient distortions were obvious once you knew to look exaggerated cities, phantom monsters at the edges, but today's manipulations are invisible, woven into code we'll never see. When your GPS shaves 3 minutes off a commute by routing you through a toll bridge owned by a tech investor's shell company, you'll never know. When a delivery app hides mom and pop shops behind layers of algorithmically boosted chains, it feels like the natural order. That's the brilliance of modern cartographic control. It makes the curated world seem inevitable, yet the antidote is simpler than you'd think. Question the defaults. Compare maps, pull up the same location on Apple, Google, and OpenStreetMap, and watch how borders wobble, landmarks shift, priorities change. Seek out indigenous mapping projects restoring stolen place names, or crowd-sourced atlases documenting erased histories. Because maps don't just show us the world, they shape how we move through it. Every time we accept a single version of reality, we surrender to someone else's story. So next time you unfold a map, whether it's parchment or pixels, remember, the lies aren't in what's drawn. They're in what's missing, what's exaggerated, what's quietly taken for granted. The pharaohs and emperors would have killed for the control today's tech giants wield with a software update. But here's the good news, we get to choose whether to follow their lines or draw our own. If these hidden histories fascinated you, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets lurking in plain sight. And drop a comment below what's the most surprising map lie you've ever caught. Because the best way to break an illusion is to shine a light on it.